When you think of famous video game characters of the early 90s, you probably think of Mario, Sonic, Kirby, and maybe even Alex Kidd. Side note, I still have nightmares about that awful rock, paper, scissors game, but more on that later. Now, the first thing you're going to notice about this list is they're all home console game characters. And there's a good reason for this, because in the early 90s, the barrier to entry for PC gaming was much higher than that of a home console. And as such, many of the best-selling titles, with some exceptions, were produced for their respective platforms. Meaning, as far as PC went, it didn't get as much love as the home consoles when it came to original franchises. Now, this would change very rapidly throughout the 90s with games like Wolfenstein and Doom, to name a few, but in 1990, I'd argue the PC didn't really have a mascot, except perhaps for an 8-year-old boy genius called Billy Blaze, also known as Commander Keen. Now, game-wise, there were 5 mainline Commander Keen games, with several games being split into multiple episodes, with one of the key reasons for this being that the first episode in the titles that supported this were distributed as shareware. Shareware, yes, that's a word I've not used in a long time. The good old days. So the first game is Invasion of the Vorticons. The story basically has Keen land on Mars, only to have his ship raided of its key components and therefore stranding him on Mars. As the game progresses, you get a better understanding of the motivations of the Vorticons and visit new and familiar locations across the galaxy to help end the Vorticon threat. The next entry is Keen Dreams. Has Keen fall into a deep slumber where he's attacked by vegetables of all things, turned evil by an evil dream machine. Returning to the intergalactic theme, we got Keen in Goodbye Galaxy, where after picking up a radio message about the galaxy being destroyed by an unknown threat, he jets off in his spaceship to find the Oracle. Yeah, where have I heard this before? To find out exactly what this threat is to the galaxy and how to stop it. The last PC game was Keen in Aliens Ate My Babysitter, where Keen's babysitter is abducted by aliens and it's up to Keen to find out why and save her. There was also a Game Boy Color game, just known as Commander Keen, which again sees Keen trying to save the universe with an antagonist trying to stop him at every turn. There was also another game titled Keen in the Universe is Toast, which was planned to release in late 1992, but was cancelled after id Software decided to focus their resources on Doom after the success that Wolfenstein 3D had enjoyed. All of the games, perhaps with the only exception being the Game Boy Color title, received generally favourable reviews at the time, with the Game Boy Color version receiving most of its criticism for its visuals and scrolling as opposed to its core gameplay. Now, the first I played Commander Keen was as a shareware version of the first game, and I didn't actually play the complete games until much later on. But as with many shareware games at the time, you actually got an awful lot of game with the shareware version, so I did put a lot of hours into these titles. In this video, I'm going to be looking mainly at Invasion of the Vorticons and Goodbye Galaxy, simply because that's what's easily available nowadays. But it is important to recognise the role that Keen Dreams played in acting as a bit of a bridge between these two titles. Before we continue, a massive thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you enjoy this content, please do consider subscribing. It helps support the channel and you can be notified of new content the moment it drops. With that out of the way, let's grab our pogo stick, charge up our ray gun, and head back to 1990 to remember Commander Keen. Gameplay-wise, whichever game in the series you're playing, you're getting a 2D side-scrolling platformer centered around collecting items to progress the level and expand the story. You might even say it has Metroidvania elements, and yes, I can hear the people coming for me with pitchforks in the comments. While Mario had his power-ups, Sonic had his immense speed, and Alex Kidd had his motorbike, Keen had a pogo stick. Now, this is interesting for a few reasons. Firstly, because one of the key things that make a good side-scroller, or more to the point, good platformer, is tight controls, and the very nature of a pogo stick makes this quite a challenge. The other element is that it offers a lot more map verticality than was typically present in this time period. In fact, there are whole levels in the game where your objective is to move upwards instead of the traditional left to right, or as Keen sometimes does it, right to left. Keen does do a good job though of keeping traversal fresh by varying the map geometry and exit locations for each stage. Speaking about precision, I have the luxury of playing this game for this video with a Retrobit Sega Genesis controller, being emulated as a Gravis PC pad. But back when I first played these games, a gamepad was certainly out of the reach for a young Azadash, and I needed to rely on the keyboard. Trying to play this on a keyboard in modern times was frankly a disaster. I died so many times. I honestly have no idea how I played this as a child, but clearly it's a skill that I've lost over time. The controls for the games, in particular the first entry, have not aged well. Actually, I don't even think that they were that great at the time of release compared to other titles, and 30 odd years has certainly not improved them. Now, Goodbye Galaxy does control a lot better, in part due to a smoother scrolling of the game and some handy mechanics like grappling onto ledges. It's not great, but it's certainly a lot more playable than the first entry. This brings me to my next point, the evolution of each of the episodes and broader games in the series. Now, while all of the games do share some similarities, there are many evolutions across the games which help to make, in my opinion, the later games the best in the series. Looking at what is arguably known as Keen 1, which is Episode 1 of Attack of the Vorticons, compared to, say, Keen 5, which is Episode 2 of Goodbye Galaxy, they look nothing alike. The level of enhancement and polish in the latter, with just a year between them, is frankly incredible and a real testament to the top-tier development from id Software. It's not just presentation though, it's game mechanics. Where the first game has you looking for keycards to unlock doors to progress, the latter entry has you not only searching for keycards, but gems and characters hidden within the level to progress. When you look at the changes between modern games in the same series today and what id Software did with Commander Keen, you really have to admire what was done. Now, when you're not admiring the game's mechanics and platforming, you'll be collecting various sweets, from chocolate bars, to pop drinks, to strange bags of white powder. Right. Okay, let's just assume it's sugar, shall we? With an extra life awarded each 20,000 points, and believe me, you will need these extra lives because Keen is a challenging game, no matter the entry. There's no ring or mushroom protection here. One hit from an enemy and Keen will bite the dust and need to restart the level over. And with some of the larger levels and complex key sequences, this is a real pain. Honestly, there are some levels which make Elden Ring look like a giant tutorial sequence. But I have to say that the game is mostly, and I do stress mostly, fair. When you die, it's your own fault. The one exception to this is some of the vertical platforming on the pogo stick, where because of the camera lag, it's possible to pogo right into an enemy, and yet that gets old very quickly. Now, while a single touch or hit by an enemy will end Keen, his enemies are much more sturdy than he is, with many of the alien and robotic foes taking several shots from Keen's ray gun to stun. Yes, that's right, 8-year-old Billy Blaze doesn't kill or destroy these aliens, he just stuns them. Kids rating, here we come. Although he does appear to die himself, so I'm not quite sure how that works. Anyway, the ray gun is powered by ray gun charges, which can be found throughout the various levels in the game, and broadly speaking, I didn't have any problems with ammo capacity. A lot of the time because it's often a legitimate strategy to avoid enemies as opposed to stunning them. Of course, this strategy can come unstuck when you're required to backtrack in the game levels, but overall it's a decent tactic that pays off more times than not. One of the other reasons why it's sometimes best to avoid enemies as opposed to stun them is because Keen can't shoot on an angle, meaning that if an enemy is approaching you from a diagonal angle, you have pretty much no way to stun them without getting hit and restarting the level. I don't really know how this could have easily been solved without breaking something else, so I'll give this a free pass for a mechanic over the time. Now, one of the strengths of the series is the level design, both in the design of the levels as well as the locations visited. Where you start off in quite simple levels in the first episode, by the time you get to the fifth, you're getting pretty detailed areas with different types of environmental themes like forests, ice, deserts, and more. The art direction, especially in the later titles, is one of the areas of the game that does hold up well and wouldn't look out of place in a modern pixel art game. Now, while there are pits of spikes to fall into and kill the player, the game, like many platformers of the era, doesn't have full damage concept, and this is very welcome because, as I mentioned earlier, with the lack of precision in the pogo stick, you're going to fall in this game. A lot. But thanks to said pogo stick, you can easily rescale whatever you've been climbing relatively quickly, not dramatically impacting the overall pacing of the game. Another series staple in the Keen games is the ability to tackle many of the levels in whichever order you choose, being gated only by environmental elements, which block progression until a particular level is completed. This is a really nice touch and not something I remember from other games of the time, even the objective masterpieces doing. As for sound, it scales as you would expect from a game series at the time, with everything from the humble PC speaker to a dedicated sound card being supported. Now, the first episodes in Attack of the Bordercons didn't include a dedicated soundtrack, but the episodes in the later games included a pretty good soundtrack for the time, a kind of upbeat synth soundtrack which varied across the locations visited. We're not talking Sega Genesis Sunsoft's Batman levels of audio quality, not in the slightest, but for the time, on PC, it was quite solid for a game marketed towards kids. Likewise, all of the effects turn in solid performances, with everything sounding purposeful and impactful, especially when using a dedicated sound card in the later titles. Now, when I look back at Commander Keen, I only have fond memories. It was one of my first platforming game experiences ever, and in hindsight, one of the best for the time that I was able to play. But time has not been kind to Commander Keen, and several of the mechanics, mainly around control as I mentioned earlier, are very challenging to play after decades of games with better controlled implementations. A few years ago, at Bethesda's E3 2019 conference, a reimagined Commander Keen title for mobile was announced, being a strategy game using cards as opposed to a platformer. Almost 5 years later, and there hasn't been any official announcements on a release date of this, with its landing page on the Bethesda website quietly being removed. Safe to say, I don't think this title will see the light of day. Then a few years later, we did get a reimagining of another game from that time, Alex Kidd in Miracle World DX. And while the original game never really reached critical acclaim, the remake reportedly ended up faring far worse, bringing back all of the troublesome elements of the original without doing anything particularly new. Now, remakes and reimaginings can work. You just need to look at the countless releases of games like Sonic and Mario, or even Doom for PC. But all of these games had one thing in common. They were largely regarded as a masterpiece when they were originally released. And like any good masterpiece, many of the game's mechanics, which when you remove presentation, which can be subjective for the time, is really what can carry a game on for generations. Tetris is a good example of this. Sadly, while I thoroughly enjoyed Commander Keen, I don't think everyone did. And with a limited audience of the time on PC, this probably didn't help. While I'm grateful for the PC releases, and indeed the shareware concepts, I do wonder how Keen would have fared on the much more available home consoles at the time. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.